Hello again. This is part 2 of hearing the voice of God for ourselves and others. Hope it ministers to you, and again, we look forward to your comments on our blog site. Now we're going to talk about how we hear God's voice, or perhaps better put, how does God communicate with us in an immediate and personal way. God is capable of communicating to us through all of our senses, but most of the time He communicates to us through our mind and our emotions. He places thoughts and images in our minds, and He can do likewise with our emotions. Now it's ironic because I hear people say that God can't plant a thought in someone's mind. Ironic because these are the same people that tell me that Satan tempts them regularly. Well, what is temptation but a thought that arises in our mind, which comes from the enemy? If Satan can drop thoughts in our mind, why can't God drop thoughts in our mind? The fact is, He does, He can, and He does it far more regularly than we understand. So, how does He do that? Well, the first way He does that is through mental images. You know, when someone says, well, I pictured this in my mind, or I saw this in my mind, they're seeing something in what we call the mind's eye. Well, God's more than capable of dropping an image into our mind. When I first began to experience the gift of prophecy, it was mostly through mental images. When we are waiting to hear something from the Lord, trying to see something from the Lord usually impedes the process. He is quite capable of doing it without us conjuring it up. So a quiet trust is the best posture for listening to God. Well, let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about, because these examples will probably make the process more clear. In the church that I was a part of in Canada, our Sunday mornings were orderly and relatively normal, but our Sunday nights were experimental and risky. And I taught regularly in a smaller group of enthusiastic Christians what it meant to hear the voice of God. And the subject for this evening was mental images. After teaching upon how they came and how we wait for them, we decided to experiment with it. I invited the Holy Spirit to come and give the people in the room mental images, and then we waited. After a few minutes, someone shared an unusual image. It was of a very large, expensive business desk with a large leather bag tied with the cord around the top and having a dollar sign on the side of the bag. Just the sort of image you would see in a cartoon when someone wants to portray a large sum of money. Well, the way he described it was this bag was just sitting on the desk. I asked the group, does this image mean anything to anyone in the group? Well, surprisingly, a man at the back of the room, who happened to be a world-class effluence engineer with a very large international engineering firm, raised his hand and spoke out. He said, on Tuesday, my firm is going to meet with the bank to borrow a very large sum of money. If we don't get it, over 1,000 of our engineers are going to be laid off and be without work. So I asked the person who got the money bag image to link up with the engineer, and off they went to pray. Well, the next person to share was a woman named Lucy. With some embarrassment, she said she saw a cat sitting. Just an image of a cat sitting. I asked if a cat sitting meant anything to anyone in the room, and no surprise, no one claimed it. Well, a few minutes later, a woman named Joy, who was sitting 2 rows behind Lucy, said, with considerable reluctance, that she saw a large bear standing upright on its hind legs. She said she wasn't going to share it, but since Lucy had the courage to share the cat, she would risk sharing the bear. Again, I asked, does anyone want to claim the bear? And there was no one, of course. To no surprise to me, nobody claimed the bear or the cat. Well, the evening went on with more images being claimed by more people, until there were only a few people remaining seated in their chairs. Remaining seated were the cat lady, the bear lady, and between them, a new lady I'd never seen before. I asked her if she'd come to our meeting wanting prayer, and she said yes. Since there was only the cat and the bear ladies left, I asked Joy and Lucy, would you go with this new lady and would you pray with her? And they said yes, and off they went. About 40 minutes later, Joy came back full of joy, no pun intended. I mean, she was lit up. She said, you'll never guess what happened. It was absolutely amazing. She said, "The lady we prayed for is Russian, and her last name in Russian is Bear, and the nickname her parents gave her is Cat." Imagine being this lady who hears about a church that prays powerful prayers for people. She comes to the meeting not knowing whether or not God knows her name. She comes hoping to encounter God. She's surrounded by strangers, and God gives two strangers her name in Russian. Do you think she was encouraged? Do you think maybe she'll remember that night for the rest of her life? Anyway, this story illustrates a very important point about mental images and prophetic words in general. And the point is this: often the message that comes to us may seem nonsensical or even irrational. After all, a bear or a cat isn't much of a message from God. The temptation that we have with such a cryptic word is either not to give it or to try to add some sort of meaning or interpretation, like God says you're like a little kitten resting in his lap, or with God's help you're as strong as a bear. I've got great admiration for Joy and Lucy because they risked looking foolish by simply giving exactly what they saw without attempting to interpret it. And they opened the door for God to say exactly what he wanted to say to this woman. There are many more stories I could tell, and they're all contained in the book, but there are some conclusions we can draw from this story, and if you read the book, from the rest of the stories. The first thing to remember is that mental images are not just snapshots. They can also come as mini movies, like a scene being enacted in our mind's eye. Now, this scene may be purely imaginary, or maybe something we've actually seen in our past. One of the most profound experiences I had to do with the movie I saw of Catherine Coleman, which ended up being a prophetic message for a young girl describing her future ministry. As I've said previously, normally it's a mistake to try to interpret a mental image. Most of the time, the key to using mental images well is to try to avoid adding to what you've seen by interpreting the image. If it's an image from God, it will mean something to the person receiving it, either immediately or later. We should be secure enough to have the attitude of a UPS driver. He just delivers the packages. He doesn't feel the need to open them and explain the contents. The application for today's teaching is that we should begin to pay more attention to the things that spontaneously pop into our minds. When we're praying for someone and our eyes are closed and we see something in our mind's eye, there's a very good chance that it's from God and will mean something. If it does, so much the better. If it doesn't, at least we learn to risk and to try. So go out and take risks and pay attention to the things that might be God popping into your mind.